Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Magsy. As always, it's the ICEBERG. We know why we're here. Fun little tidbits about our fun little spider guy. And now we're on the 5th tier, which means we are 5/7 of the way done. What's the math on that? We are 71.4285. We're almost there. But let's start ourselves off easy with Ben Parker. Because Ben Parker, we know him, we love him, we mourned him. He is an incredibly crucial part of the Spider-Man mythos, the catalyzing event of Spider-Man, who Spider-Man becomes, which leads some people to find it odd that he is mentioned so sparingly in the MCU. Yes, we know about exactly enough to confirm that he existed at one point, he's dead now, and that it was a big deal for Peter and May. But besides that, not really anything. Not even a face to the man. Unless, because eagle-eared viewers rewatching the first Iron Man movie noticed that in the first press conference scene, right when Tony is back from the cave with a bunch of scraps, he refers to one of the reporters by his first name, and this reporter's first name just so happens to be Ben. Now, is this a coincidence? Probably. But it's still possible that this could be our mysterious MCU Ben Parker. First of all, Exhibit A. As far as I'm aware, he is the only established named Ben in the MCU that is a civilian. So by process of elimination, this Ben the reporter is canonically the most likely to be Ben, as far as we know. But in all seriousness, there is actually some validity to the theory. First of all, we never hear a last name, which sure doesn't confirm, but also does not deny? Contradict. We'll use that word. It doesn't contradict this as being a potential Ben Parker. Plus, we do know that Jon Favreau and the writing team were aware of Spider-Man's existence because in the first draft of the end credits scene with Nick Fury pointedly mentions radioactive bug bites. And if you know who Spider-Man is, you know who Ben is. Which is why it's more noticeable when you start to think about it, just how absent Ben Parker is from the John Watts MCU Spider-Man iteration. But why is that? Well, it's for time. I'm not going to try to be like gracefully transitioning or artsy-fartsy narrative speaking into this topic. It's just a matter of time. That's what it was. Because remember, when we are introduced to Spider-Man, it's not even in his movie. It's in Captain America Civil War. Meaning that even if they were going to go with a Spider-Man right off the bat origin story, it couldn't have happened in Civil War. Like, we couldn't have heard anything about Bites or Uncle Ben's because would literally be no time to do that in the Captain America movie. And since Peter is already starting off already a few months into being Spider-Man, like legitimately, then of course we're not going to see much of Uncle Ben. And of course we're not going to be able to hear much about Uncle Ben. And then also the fact of like, oh, well, he just, anytime he tries to talk about him, it kind of gets steamrolled or interrupted. Because if you lose somebody, especially, because if somebody close to you dies, especially in such a seemingly random and abrupt way as a fatal mugging gunshot wound, then yeah, you're gonna be pretty hesitant to talk about that, especially talking about like, hey, this is exactly why my uncle's death is so significant to me, because it was so traumatic and I was there. Because, in case I haven't said it, or just to put like a fine point on it, we already know, we the audience know this. We were there for the Raimi. We were there for the first Raimi movie. We were there for the first Mark Webb movie. We know what happened to Uncle Ben. We don't necessarily have to deal with it because we already know. We, the audience, know. We watched the Raimi Spider-Man. We watched the Mark Webb Spider-Man. We know exactly what happened to Uncle Ben already, so we don't necessarily need a refresher course on that. Oh boy, now we get to talk about the Clone Saga. This is going to take a while, because there was the first Clone Saga storyline in 1974 where Jackal cloned Spider-Man, but that's not the one we're talking about. We're talking about the sequel one in 1994, and what you need to know about it is development-wise, it was a mess. It was initially supposed to last maybe a year, between 94 to 95. It kept going for 3 years, specifically because it was specifically because it had the bad luck of being too successful too quickly. Therefore, the higher-ups pushed for extensions, and because they were the higher-ups, those extensions got extended again and again and again until eventually everybody wasn't buying the comics anymore. They were sick of it. Because again, it was 3 years of the same storyline being told, no conclusion, for 3 years with no other Spider-Man comic material coming out. Every comic was revolved around the Clone Saga, which meant that a whole bunch of stuff happened, so many things, so much to the point where it is very unlikely that the end product actually adhered to the original design, because the crazy thing about it is it didn't even adhere to the original editor. Tom DeFalco was the first editor who was working or somehow involved in the Spider-Man Clone Saga project. He got fired and then got replaced by Bob Budakis. Bob B, and then he got fired and replaced by Bob Horace. All 3 men respectfully having entirely different ideas as to what they were doing with Clone Saga. For example, Bob B, when he was being fired, wrote out a memo begging, pleading the writing team for Clone Saga, do not bring Norman Osborn back, do not resurrect him, keep him dead. Which was a sentiment that pretty much all of the other writers felt too, but Bob Horace was the one who said, yeah, let's do it. Because according to him, Norman Osborn was the only Spider-Man villain at the time that would have the means and maybe the motivation to do all of the harebrained, convoluted stuff that happens in the Clone Saga. Which, sure, but also the only established character. You could have created a new big fish character who was like, you could have made the Riddler but Spider-Man themed. There's a new character to start off fresh, but you didn't, which you could have done because this whole 3-year saga did introduce a lot of characters, even outside of Ben Reilly and Kane and other clones. So yeah, there was no way that the original outline survived or like came out unscathed. While we don't know for certain what exactly that original outline may have looked like, we do have the next best thing, which is 2009's Clone Saga, which is a 6-issue miniseries detailing and restructuring the events of the 94 Clone Saga, with Tom DeFalco as the main writer, following his original notes and adhering to those heavily, writing this 2009 sequel or requel? I don't know. And while it is established as being out of continuity, meaning that the 94 saga still stands, and the 09 the 09 saga doesn't count necessarily towards like the established canon history, it is still an interesting insight into what would have been if, things were allowed to be the way they originally were. We have a couple of other Clone Saga tidbits in this too, so let's just get them out of the way. So like I mentioned before, the Clone Saga introduced a couple of characters, including villains like Gaunt. And in the beginning, Gaunt was supposed to be the alter ego of Harry Osborn, who would have been revealed to have not actually died in Spectacular Spider-Man issue number 200. Oh yeah, by the way, Harry Osborn dies in Spectacular Spider-Man issue number 200. For you see, Harry Osborn would have been suffering from a negative side effect of the Goblin Serum, that being cellular degradation, probably. It's described as like weakening and withering away the body. And it would have also been revealed that Gaunt, aka Harry Ayersburn, would have been the one who would have been masterminding all of the Clone Saga stuff. Because do keep in mind, like I said, there was a lot of changes going on. And eventually, at some point, it was just the entire writing team, including the editors-in-chief, just throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying to make the Mona Lisa that way. I don't even necessarily think they were trying to make a Mona Lisa. They were just like, we need paint on a canvas. We just need to get a full, finished, rendered painting. even if it looks strange, even if it's Picasso, it's fine. We just need a full thing. But eventually the Gaunt idea was reworked to not be Harry, but instead its own standalone character, and that's how we got Mendel Strom and a more cybernetically enhanced focused version of Gaunt, which is still interesting. But yeah, things changed. But now my mind's on spaghetti. And speaking of spaghetti, there was but now my mind's on spaghetti. So the other but now my mind's on spaghetti, and there's another spaghetti-related thing here, Clone Saga-wise, as in throwing ideas at a dartboard, which was a time loop. That's right, one of the pitched ideas for the finale of the series, when Marvel finally let it die, was to essentially reveal that it was a lie, that Ben Reilly was not a clone, but rather a future version of Peter Parker from 5 years into the future, who was sent back by Mephisto for reasons. And at the end of it all, it would have culminated in future Peter Parker having to choose whether or not he sacrifices past Peter Parker or himself, aka future Peter Parker. Which, if you're working on Back to the Future logic, which I'm assuming that's what they would be doing since this was in the 90s, it would never not be the right choice to choose yourself. Because if you choose the past self, you're still dying. Because the past self doesn't exist, there's no way the future you can exist, so then the future you don't exist either, so you're still dying. So really what it boils down to is the fact that if he chooses past Peter, not only does he not exist, but also the 5 years of good that he did also goes away. And there is not one Peter Parker in the universe, multiverse even, that would not do that math and would not choose to preserve that. And it probably wouldn't have even mattered either, because most likely the ending would have involved breaking the time loop, because otherwise Marvel just put a 5-year doomsday clock on their most successful, profitable, most marketable character, and that would be crazy. It was all crazy, there was some good, there was some bad, but it all happened, and now we're still alive. The world didn't end, but yeah, interesting ideas, right? Oh yeah, while researching this, I also saw people make the connection of, it's interesting how back in around 95 or 96, like the years that they would be like developing these finale ideas, there was the observation that Mephisto's involvement in this time loop idea significantly predates Mephisto interfering with Peter's life in One More Day, which is interesting because it does beg the question of why do Spider-Man writers love involving the devil? Specifically the devil to torment God's strongest soldier, Spider-Man, because it does beg the question of why do Spider-Man writers love involving the devil so much, especially as an adversary to Spider-Man? Because you would imagine that a villain like Mephisto, the literal, like, at the crossroads, devil with a capital D, devil, would be more within the territories of Blade or Doctor Strange or anybody else. But Mephisto is an antagonist that is particularly focused on Spider-Man, which, yes, I know. Which, yes, I know the fact that, there was a prophecy or a vision of the future that Mephisto saw where Spider-Man thwarted his rule over Earth. But also, still, somebody had to write that into existence. So, like, what's good? Why is Mephisto so deeply involved? I'm not necessarily complaining. I just want to see the math behind it. I'm curious more than anything else. And speaking of curiosity, the full acclamation combat and defense exoskeleton. Please don't ask me what an exoskeleton is. I tried looking it up, did not get immediate results, and then I forgot to do further research. What's curious about Facade, first of all, it was a suit. It was a experimental state-of-the-art combat suit. And what's curious about it is it greatly overshadowed the thief who stole it and tried to fight or commit crime with it. Because the Facade suit, first of all, pretty interesting. Because the Facade suit, fully equipped not just with the increased strength and durability that an exoskeleton would give you, which I'm assuming is similar to an exoskeleton, so yes, standard in that way, while also supplying the wearer with jet boots for flight as well as energy blasting gauntlets powered by the wearer's bioelectricity. Damn. And this suit was stolen by somebody, and we never figure out who it is. The first time, because the first time, while Spider-Man is able to disable the suit, it also takes a lot out of him, so he does pass out, giving the criminal enough time to flee the scene before being identified. And then the next time it gets stolen, Spider-Man again defeats him, and the villain actually does surrender and offer to reveal his identity. And if I remember correctly, I didn't write it down. It was either Spider-Man, like Peter's mind was preoccupied with other things, so he just like let that slide. He's like, I don't care, I've got other things on my mind. Or he just straight up did not care. Which does make the acronym of the name interesting, facade, because facades are inherently things that are used to cover up somebody's true self. And a lot of the times, the facade that people wear are, by design, more interesting than the actual person. So it doesn't actually matter who is underneath the facade. The general person cares more so about the thing itself, the cover, the veil, which is exactly this case, because the person underneath is probably inconsequential. It would be different if it was the inventor of the facade suit, because then it's more of a threat of he is smart enough to make the suit and operate the suit and repair the suit if need be, or create a new one if need be. It's also like he's not well connected enough to just buy the suit outright. If that was the case, then he wouldn't need to steal it. It is absolutely the first Avengers movie point of like, take off the suit and what are you? But unlike Tony, we can at least safely rule out that this guy is not a genius, a millionaire, a playboy, or a philanthropist. It's just a dude. So the suit is the thing that is inherently a threat, but the person behind it, not so much. So it's easy to dismiss the identity, easy to dismiss the person, because who cares? The suit is the thing that is dangerous. Oh yes, our good old friend Turn Off the Dark. I'm pretty sure I made a point of not getting into the incidents because, or, the injuries on set, because I saw this here in the 5th tier of the iceberg even back then. But it is one of the most notable things about Turn Off the Dark. Second or third only to the fact that it was the most expensive Hollywood production in Broadway history. Because at least one of the most interesting things about Turn Off the Dark is the safety violations. It was bad. A total of 6 people were injured, and between the New York State Department of Labor and OSHA, because a total of 6 people were injured while working on Turn Off the Dark, and the production was cited with five significant safety violations, 2 from the New York State Department of Labor and 3 from OSHA. And when you look into it, no kidding, because there were stunt people who were breaking their ankles and wrists, alongside Natalie Mendoza, who was playing the main antagonist, Arachne, who suffered a concussion after being struck by equipment in the wings. She got a concussion from that and then kept going against her doctor's wishes. And it was only once she actually felt her brain start doing backflips in her head that she decided, maybe I'll sit in. I'll sit down. I'll step aside for maybe just a couple weeks, and then kept going. She did eventually step down fully, but it was still weeks, maybe even a month or so after the initial concussion, which is far more than most people would probably have given. Then there was also Daniel Curry, who played one of the other villains, as well as played as a stunt double, who suffered leg trauma after being pinned under a piece of equipment. One of the most, evolutionarily terrifying scenarios is what he dealt with having, a heavy thing pin his leg specifically. I would have absolutely felt like a coyote who was, this close to gnawing off his own foot because it's stuck in a bear trap. Jesus. But the largest spectacle of an injury was actually suffered by Christopher Tierney, who was a stunt performer. Okay, so to explain this, you've got to remember that this is a Spider-Man production, and Spider-Man is a character that is inherently based around complex aerial acrobatics. So to emulate that, the theater, the stage had to be rigged with a complicated fly system. And if you don't know what a fly system is, it's essentially like the series of pulleys and ropes. It's the series of pulleys and ropes on a stage that helps lift up curtains, bring them down, open them, close them, all that kind of stuff. And they had a system where they essentially rigged people onto it so that they could fly in the air while being pulled on ropes and pulleys, which does sound fun in concept, and I'm sure it is, but also, like, it's dangerous. You've got to be, like, on your A game every time. And ideally, your safety equipment is on its A games at all times. Unfortunately, that was not the case for Christopher, who had his safety harness break, or just have it fail, is what it's written as, causing him to fall 21 feet into the orchestra pit. Which, it's the orchestra pit. It's where the orchestra things go, including the orchestra equipment, which commonly includes heavy and or sharp metal objects. So either Mr. Tierney fell into the orchestra pit and by some miracle of God did not have something slice open or crack in half. Well, maybe things cracked in half, I don't know. Or, best case scenario, it was empty, but it's still a big wooden pit at the bottom of the stage, so it's less than ideal for stunt landings. And either way, he was hospitalized. And then he had to be, I think, transferred into, like, a physical therapy situation. It was like an institute, like a college in the area. So luckily nobody died, but Jesus. No wonder Turn Off the Dark was the most expensive Broadway production of all time. So there has to have been a huge chunk out of the $75 million budget that was just paying for injury or safety related issues. Oh, and speaking of missing the mark, let's talk about Canon Film Spider-Man. Because once upon, I think, one video ago, we talked about James Cameron Spider-Man and how that story started when Carol Co. approached Canon Films about acquiring the production rights to Spider-Man, rather than going to Marvel directly, because at this point Marvel had already sold it to Canon Films. But why to Canon Films? Well, because they wanted to make their own Spider-Man movie. With the craziest part about it being, both Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, cousins and chiefs on the Canon staff, had no idea who Spider-Man was. Which is not only insane, but it's also crazy what they thought it was. Because they thought it was a Wolfman story. They wrote it as a Wolfman story. It was insane. The first draft was a corporate scientist subjects ID badge photographer, Peter Parker, to radiation, transforming him into a hairy, self-destructive, 8-armed monster. Which, so to be fair, there are instances of Peter Parker growing additional limbs and becoming a more like feral version of Spider-Man. But to be even more fair, those are never permanent. Nor were they ever the starting note of the character. Those were always like wild, wacky things that happened. It didn't start with him being a man-spider, and then he eventually became Spider-Man. It is not how it happens. It was so much not the story at all, not Spider-Man at all, that Stan Lee insisted that they rewrote it. Because believe it or not, he was not too happy having what he perceived to be a debasement of his creation being made. So he was like, no, you gotta fix this. Rewrite it. Start over. Which they did. And they wrote a new draft, and it was far more coherent, consistent with the traditional Spider-Man story, origin story, to be particular. But people closely involved with the project would later say that it would become a good script that was made worse with multiple rewrites, which I would not have trouble believing, because the original idea for the first draft was that it would have Otto Octavius as the like early mentor figure turned main antagonist, who Peter Parker is a student of, or he's like an apprentice of some sort. But then this, what is referred to as a cyclodrone or cyclotron incident, creates Spider-Man and then deforms Doc Ock, which, cool. it would not only deform Doc Ock's body, but also probably his mind, because then he turns into the sort of obsessive mad scientist in the pursuit of trying to discover something called the fifth force, which is a real-world concept in physics. It refers to the hypothetical fundamental force beyond the fourth known forces: gravitational, electromagnetic, strong nuclear, and weak nuclear. So it would be Doc Ock trying to find the fifth mystery element, or mystery force, I guess. Fifth Element is a different movie. However, in later rewrites, this was simplified to just be a pursuit of anti-gravity, which, sure, is a more, like, easily understandable idea, but also I do believe it would have been more within the conventional Doc Ock's character to be so up his own farts that he doesn't just need to discover anti-gravity, he needs to discover something that is potentially theoretically impossible. Also, they made weird additions to the character, like he had a sidekick and then he had like a catchphrase, "Okie dokie," which for a different villain may not be that big of a deal, but Otto Octavius, at least in my perception, tends to be a character that is very much defined by ego and narcissism, and a catchphrase like "okie dokie" is inherently a more like positive or lighthearted thing. Like, it works for, I think her name is Lucy for the Fallout series, because she is literally a ray of sunshine. She is, incredibly optimistic and lighthearted, even after being drugged through radioactive hell that is the wasteland. She does still preserve a sense of self in being, like, good and kind and lighthearted. That's why even after she becomes kind of, like, hardened and, firmed up by trauma of the war that is the wasteland again, there is still that core of goodness where Okie dokie exists, which maybe it works if Doc Ock was going through like a Sam Raimi direction where it was like a good person corrupted by bad tech, but assumingly Okie dokie would be a Doc Ock thing, not an Otto Octavius thing. Or maybe there's a lot of different ways that it could have been spun. It probably would not have been run in a compelling way, according to what, again, people said, where it was like a good script that was made worse over time. Yeah, and I do think that the sidekick would probably be the more intrusive thing, because then it would have to be Doc Ock having to potentially share credit with a sidekick, or with like a person he inherently sees as inferior to him, being someone who helped discover this thing. So at best, the sidekick would have died by the end of the movie. And what's interesting is, while it did not live long enough to get into production, it did live long enough for them to start fielding out for casting options, which, oh boy. First of all, for Doc Ock, they were considering Bob Hoskins, who I know as Eddie Valiant, I think is his name, the detective from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, hey, I wouldn't have a problem with. I loved him in Who Framed. I'm sure I would have loved to see him in something Spider-Man related. For Stan Lee, he personally expressed desire to play J. Jonah Jameson, which, yes, it would not have been as iconic as J.K. Simmons, but you have to admit that you would have loved to see that too. And for consideration for Peter Parker, there was one, Scott Leva, who he acted as an actor and a stunt double. He posed for promotional ads for Canon, and as well as made public appearances as Spider-Man for Marvel, so he did have experience in the suit at least. With the other consideration being, and let's keep in mind here, let's remember, this was back in 1985, back when this human being was considered an up-and-comer in the acting scene, because for the leading role of Peter Parker, the directors and executives and everybody, whoever, was considering Tom Cruise to play as Peter Parker. Are you kidding me? That would have aged horribly, but it is interesting, because back in the earlier tiers of this iceberg chart, we learned about the alternative universe cut of Into the Spider-Verse, where there is a movie That is like an exaggerated biopic theatrical thing. It is a movie about Spider-Man, and in that version with that movie, there was a joke character that was just straight up Tom Cruise. That was going to be the joke that Tom Cruise played in a not at all faithful to reality, not at all faithful to reality version of Spider-Man, which I don't remember if I read it or not, but like, was this a reference to that? Because if it is a reference, that's insane. That's crazy. And the Sony team for the Spider-Verse movies are absolutely on their A game. I mean, they are already, we know this, but like, if this was a reference, that means they were there from the beginning. They were always cooking a 5-course meal. Three Dev Adam, or Three Giant Men, is a Turkish superhero film from 1973 featuring Captain America, El Santo, and a villainous Spider-Man. Captain America and El Santo are sent on a mission to Istanbul to stop the villainous Spider-Man and his criminal gang. In this reality, the Turkish Spider-Man was a former wrestler turned supervillain, crime boss, gang leader, all that kind of stuff. Which is interesting because it also answers the question, or leads into the question. And in case you don't know who El Santo is, because I'll be honest, I didn't know him either, he was actually an incredibly famous Mexican luchador who was also pretty much like a legend. Or rather, became a legend, because within his 5-decade-long career as a professional luchador, he also made numerous appearances both in luchador films and in comic books where he is commonly a champion for the common person, or for the common people. And in doing so, he established his legacy as a folk hero, which is very interesting, and I think is very good. I want to start watching luchador films because of that. But it's also interesting because in this version, evil Turkish Spider-Man was originally a luchador fighter, or luchador wrestler. He was a luchador wrestler who then turned to a life of crime for one reason or another, which is interesting for 2 reasons, because when I did talk to somebody about this, they did point out the fact of like, oh, that's interesting, it's a story about a Mexican luchador fighter fighting a former other luchador, but it's a Turkish film? Which, who knows, maybe it's a spaghetti western thing where it's like a Wild West story, but it was filmed / produced in Italy. But it's also interesting because luchador fighting, or like masked fighters, goes hand in hand with the Spider-Man story. I mean, he literally starts off as a professional wrestler in most versions of his origin story. And, fun fact, in the Amazing Spider-Man movie, there was literally the moment that inspires Peter to start wearing a mask is when he falls through the ceiling of an old wrestling building with like a full ring and everything, and one of the signs is a big like poster billboard for a masked luchador fighter. I don't remember if his name was Naranja, like if it was actually like the Spider, but it was still a luchador mask. So there is an interesting correlation between luchadors and Spider-Man, and we see it here as well, which I think is interesting. So we're still in the 80s, but we are talking about that time that the Department of Agriculture commissioned or like sponsored a couple of public service announcements based around Spider-Man making terrible financial decisions. Because in both, I think there were like animated shorts, Spider-Man saves an unnamed town from this big bad threat. In one, it's a T-Rex, and the other, it's a giant fly. We're just gonna have to speed by that. And the mayor not only gives Spider-Man a medal, but also offers a cash reward both times of $40 million. And in both times, Spider-Man says, you know, in all honesty, I'd rather have a banana. And in the other one, he says it's an orange. He essentially he refuses a $40 million cash reward specifically because he would rather have one piece of fruit. Which, first of all, just use some of the money to buy multiple bananas. And second of all, yes, I get that the point is it's a PSA trying to teach kids that eating healthy is important, but this is a terrible way of getting that story across. Because the message isn't, hey, bananas and oranges and fruits and vegetables are important for your body's health. The lesson is, hey, refuse money for doing good things and ask for perishable, consumable items instead. Things that go bad in like a couple of days. Yeah, take that as payment and not actual money. It just seems kind of like short-sighted or counterintuitive. But yeah, that's the thing that happened. There's a lot of weird PSAs, and we actually might see about one of them in a little bit. But there's a lot of them around. Like there's one, I know there's one that's not in the iceberg that's like Spider-Man goes to the dentist, which is by no means a bad thing. Of course, Spider-Man is a very popular character among children, so having a popular heroic figure model good behaviors is inherently a good idea. But just again, like it makes sense, or it would make more sense if you had it make sense. He's a scientist. Spider-Man is well within character to explain the biological benefits of potassium and vitamin C. Why do you need to dumb him down and say, no thanks, I don't want to be rich. I just want to have one piece of fruit. Thank you very much. James, I believe his last name is Stokoe, is a Canadian comic book artist that uploaded to the internet rough sketches of a fan comic idea that he had, which was essentially if Spider-Man was drafted into the Vietnam War, which would have featured highly detailed, interesting, captivating artwork, along with a modified version of his spider suit that would have had the sleeves torn off, had a military vest in worn over it, and it would have revolved around a masked Spider-Man, going through the motions of being within the Vietnam War. If I remember correctly, it was specifically like Spider-Man enlisted, but he didn't enlist like through Peter Parker. So like he still had a secret identity even over in Vietnam, which I may fully be misremembering that, but if that is the case, that is inherently interesting. I guess not just Peter Parker having to enlist or feeling obligated to enlist and then, having to somehow justify Spider-Man being there too. But either way, it is an interesting idea and is a kind of an interesting what if. And it kind of acts as a what if to life story, which again, we covered before. Because back in that retelling, there was talk about whether or not Spider-Man should go into the Vietnam War, whether or not it was like a superhero's obligation, or to be specific, not particular, whether it is an American superhero's obligation to go to Vietnam. That was an interesting conversation to be had, and this feels like a possible version of what one of the outcomes would have been, or the other. I'm gonna start that over. And even though this is a fan idea from, albeit a professional comic book artist, and it's not a full comic, I think there's only a couple panels that were released, at least a couple that I could find. But the artwork is still fantastic, and the idea itself is rather intriguing, and it's just a fun little thing about Spider-Man on the internet, which is all good to me. Fast forwarding all the way to 2002, MTV ordered a new Spider-Man animated series. And this series was originally going to be acting as an animated adaptation for the Ultimate Comics. However, this series altered course after the success of the first Sam Raimi movie, opting to follow the movie's continuity rather than the continuity of the Ultimate Comics. And this show did become what is known today as the new animated series. Which, that's about it. It was a pretty, straightforward topic, and it's a pretty brief answer. Yeah, it was originally going to be an Ultimate show, but then Sam Raimi's movies were received very well, so they altered course to follow the money, I guess. So, some way, somehow, there was a cheat code controversy. So, some way, somehow, back in the early 2000s, there was a cheat code controversy. And I say this because, again, previously, in an earlier episode of this series, we talked about how cheat codes were not necessarily seen as bad or wrong back in the day of, early home entertainment, because they tended to just be silly, goofy little things that made funny little things, new things happened in a game, such as the Mary Jane cheat code for Spider-Man the movie The Game, wherein the character model for Spider-Man that you play as was replaced by Mary Jane Watson, which was included again just for funsies, but it did have the unintended consequence of a lesbian kissing scene. Because at the final cutscene, at the very end of the game, Spider-Man kisses Mary Jane. But again, if you are playing with the cheat code that makes you Mary Jane, then it's Mary Jane kissing Mary Jane. It's two girls, and is two girls kissing, and apparently that was a big deal. Enough to the point that Treyarch, the developer of the game, had to remove the cheat code, assumedly because they were getting inundated with calls, letters, or complaints of other kinds of, I have to assume, certain parents who were none too happy to have a same-sex kissing scene in what is supposedly a child or children's game. Which, just food for thought, one, comic book movies and comic book games do not inherently have to be for children, because adults read comic books, and arguably, they're the ones who read comic books more than children do. And second of all, I'm more so just curious about, would they have been as upset about it if it was just Spider-Man and MJ kissing, or why was there particular, apprehension towards two girls kissing, even though it's the same girl? It's Mary Jane kissing Mary Jane. It's Mary Jane kissing Mary Jane. It should not be this big of a deal. It should just be a funny little oopsie, but I guess people got upset about it. But yeah, that is somehow the way that there was a controversy with a cheat code in an early 2000s game where multiplayer things was not even a thing. We are talking about video games, so I will add, because this one's at the end, but I will just add this to the Spider-Man 4 game, because as we know, there was going to be a fourth Sam Raimi Spider-Man game, but then Sam Raimi's confidence in making a good movie, or a good Spider-Man movie, was compromised by both critics and fans alike. We did this to ourselves. However, there was already a team working on the tie-in video game for Spider-Man 4, which obviously they had to stop because there was no longer a movie being made. How do you make a tie-in game for a movie that no longer exists? And while they didn't get super deep into development, probably because the story for the movie wasn't fully realized yet, they did have enough to have certain gameplay mechanics and game footage to show. It's in pre-alpha, so it's a little rough, but it's still what they had at hand. However, the development company for Spider-Man 4, the video game, did not let that programming go to waste, and the coding that was used for Spider-Man 4 was later adapted and used for Prototype 2. Which I am pretty sure is the only connection between Prototype series and Spider-Man, but it is an interesting connection nonetheless. So, back in the day, way back in the day, Hostess used to make comic books with Marvel to advertise their products. And these comic pages essentially consisted of Marvel superheroes solving problems using Hostess treats, with Spider-Man being one of these heroes who would bribe henchmen holding him hostage with a Hostess fruitcake. And the criminal was so happy and excited to have a Hostess fruitcake that it allowed Spider-Man to escape and save the day. Which, to be fair, is pretty unique advertising. It probably would have worked on me back in the 70s too. Especially if I was a kid, I would have been like, I fucking love Hostess fruitcakes. They saved Spider-Man. I'm only eating fruitcakes. But that's not even the craziest thing about Hostess Spider-Man, okay? The craziest thing about him is the fact that he is actually canonical. He makes an appearance in, I think it was a Spider-Geddon comics? One of the Spider-Verse comics. He exists. He fights Morlun unsuccessfully, and then he gets killed by him. Well, Morlun's the energy vampire, so he has his life drained from him. And then, if I remember correctly, Morlun was then later on cut by something called the Totem Dagger, which essentially had him bleed out all of the life energy that he took from the other Spider-Man. So if I'm not wrong, that would mean that Hostess Spider-Man is now alive again and still exists in a universe where the hero in a universe where the Marvel heroes inside that universe routinely solve their problems with Hostess products. It is wild, it is wacky, and I love it. I feel like that's what comic books are all about. Just doing whatever you want and being silly and crazy, and I love him. Hostess Spider-Man in Avengers Doomsday, that's what I want to see. And last but not least, let's talk about email leaks. I decided to save this for last because it is the most detailed one. I'm going to try not to get too lost in the sauce on the details, but let's get into it. Because back in 2014, Sony Entertainment fell victim to a massive cyber attack because they were successfully hacked by the group Guardians of Peace, who hacked Sony, leaked a large amount of confidential information before attacking Sony's computer infrastructure with a variant of the Shamoon wiper malware. Hackers be hacking, and the Guardians of Peace hacked Sony supposedly because of the interview, which, if you don't recall, is the comedy film starring real-life weirdo-in-chief James Franco as I think it was like, he was a late-night show host who got recruited by the American government to aid in the fictional assassination of Kim Jong-un. North Korea has denied all responsibility for this hacker group or for the hacking itself, because like part of the ransom was like they wanted Sony to cancel the release of the interview, and that was the connection to North Korea. It's North Korea. That's all I'll say on the matter. They denied all responsibility, and I'm just going to keep going. And within this massive leak were a lot of leaked emails from Sony person to Sony person. And I have yet to read through all of the emails. I'm not sure I will. But there were a couple that I did find interesting. First of all, there was the email talking about how best to like millennialify Spider-Man. And also, like, this email specifically was written out and formatted in a way that assumes that the person who was receiving it already knew what it was about, because it opens, or like in the opening lines, it has the phrase 35,000 LAX JFK, which I am concluding that means that these 3 bullet point ideas were made through the input of 35,000 people who were questioned at LAX and JFK International Airport. So the 3 suggestions, supposedly to make Spider-Man more relatable to millennials, are getting into experiential exercise like Tough Mudders, Color Run, and veganism. They also mention hot yoga, I know that for a fact. And also the NBD hashtag, which stands for no big deal. And they explain it like somebody who has never been online explaining online things. Because, millennials will post on the social medias about doing these experiential exercises, and they will commonly use hashtag NBD as a way to do what is called a humble brag. And it would make sense for Spider-Man to do that because he's Spider-Man. He has enhanced agility and strength, so it would be no big deal for him. And if that's the case, why is he doing it? The second one was, the only thing I have written down is the direct quote, EDM is the defining music for millennials. Because, yeah, it's only millennials listening to it. I totally don't have friends my age who listen to EDM music consistently. Yeah, totally. And, oh my god, the worst for last, a private Snapchat story. Because this email was it was sent around the time that Snap stories became a thing, or like were, introduced on Snapchat. So like the idea was getting invited into Spidey's Snapchat circle would be huge and very buzzworthy and cool. Not the double and. Not the buzzworthy. What are we doing here? And these were not the only great ideas proposed via email. In another email, somebody like proposed a whole roster of like interconnected Spider-Man movies, which they point out is very much inspired by the success of Marvel and DC, which it's even mentioned in the opening paragraphs. Like, this was absolutely inspired by Marvel and DC's success with their cinematic universes. So this was somebody's pitch in Sony, pardon me, as to what the what the future slate of Spider-Man movies should look like. Starting off with Amazing Spider-Man Kraven, which would have acted as a prequel to the sequel. So it would be like Amazing Spider-Man 2, Kraven. Then there was the Sinister Six movie, which we did talk about earlier in an earlier video. Oh yeah, and then there was the idea of having Spider-Man 2099 as the like reverse Captain America franchise, because in Captain America Captain America starts in the past and then ends up in the future. For Spider-Man 2099, it would be his story starts in the future and then ends in the past. Because the other thing that this proposal did was build up Carnage as like the Thanos character, like the big bad that everything's building up towards. Because for the Carnage movie, it would require both Peter Parker and Miguel O'Hara to team up and work together to defeat Carnage in the big movie thing, I think. With the final entry into the roster being Spider-Man 2099 2, which is just, that seems awkward of a title to me. I personally would have preferred Spider-Man Back to 2099, but that's just me. Which involves Miguel trying to get back to the future, but one of the big conflicts is he also simultaneously has to keep Tiberius Stone, his future grandfather, alive. Because again, Back to the Future rules, if his grandfather dies, then his dad's never born, then Miguel's never born, and then, oops. Oh yeah, then it says that Miguel O'Hara, like Spider-Man of 2099, also encounters Matt Gargan, the Scorpion, so that's interesting. So yeah, a lot of interesting ideas, but these were just from like the first couple of emails that I found anything about. But there's still a bunch of different Sony emails that may or may not refer to Spider-Man stuff, and I'm pretty sure all of, if not a good chunk of the information that was leaked is like organized and easily found on WikiLeaks. So if you have read through it, or you plan on reading through it for some reason, and you see other interesting Spider-Man stuff that I didn't see looking into this, then, or you didn't hear in this video, then please, by all means, share it in the comments. I would love to see it. I'm sure other people would love to see it. Yeah, I like Spider-Man. In one of the teaser trailers for Sonic 06, the cinematic, like dramatic orchestral music that plays behind it bears a very strong resemblance to the main theme in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man music, but also, I don't know how copyright law works. I don't know if YouTube knows how copyright law works still, so I'm not going to risk it, but it's very easy to find. You just look up Raimi Sonic 06, and it's like one of the first things you see. It's like a 30-second trailer, and if you listen to it, yeah, it's pretty close. Spider-Man Rocks the Vote the Spider-Man Rocks the Vote PSA was part of a national voter registration effort in 1992 to encourage people to register as new voters. With this particular campaign, I think is the word I forgot to write, being produced by Video Software Dealers Associated, with their stake in the voting game being they were urging voters to get registration forms from their participating local video stores. And again, this was part of a larger effort because the campaign had other PSAs that would run before like films and movie theaters starring, no, I'm gonna start over. Because once again, it was part of like a larger thing. A larger campaign that include other PSAs that were played in theaters before movies, starring people like Martin Sheen, who was an actor, and then Orville Redenbacher, who I'm pretty sure is the popcorn guy. Maybe he's like a general foods product guy, but I know him from the popcorn, if he does make popcorn. But also, Spider-Man Rocks the Vote was confusing for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the production itself was very eerie. It had dramatic lighting, sudden synth jabs, and serious, almost intimate tone of speaking from Spider-Man. And it all just sets like a bizarre, so almost like intimidating, menacing tones. Like, you gotta vote, you gotta register. Also, he signs it's Spider-Man, like his registration votes, which or his registration form, which I'm fairly confident Spider-Man does not have a social security number. Peter Parker does, but Spider-Man, he doesn't exist. Why is he filling out a form if he doesn't exist? A target audience of younger children around the age of too young to vote. So it is curious, so it does make it a curious thing of like, why are you trying to encourage kids who cannot legally register yet to be like, get out of your seats, get off the couch and get to the video store again to get those ballots. There was just a lot of oddities, particularly for the Spider-Man portion of this campaign. And that does it for this portion of the Spider-Man iceberg. We have got 2 left, and that's crazy. And there have been a lot of interesting topics in this video and in previous iceberg videos that I would love to cover in greater detail later on, and I probably will do it because I have the power to do that. This is my channel. But yeah, we've got 2 more tiers left, and then we're off to the races, or something else will happen. Who knows what'll happen? But I know that I am very grateful for you all. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for watching to the end of this video. Thank you for indulging in my Spider-Man shenanigans. This is obviously something I'm very, have a lot of fun talking about, so I am grateful to have an audience for that. So yeah, as always, stay happy, stay healthy, stay hydrated, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.